Imagine waking up in a world where the greatest nation on earth no longer exists. Its rulers are gone, its language has been forgotten. Its temples stand silent beneath the desert sun, and no one alive can read the words carved into their walls. That sounds like the ending of a fictional empire, but it happened to ancient Egypt. For more than 3,000 years, Egypt seemed untouchable. Long before the Roman Empire rose to power, before Greece reached its golden age, and centuries before many modern countries even existed, the pharaohs ruled a civilization unlike any the world had ever seen. They built monuments so extraordinary that they still dominate the horizon today. They mastered engineering, agriculture, astronomy, and government on a scale that amazed both their allies and their enemies. Yet despite all that power, Egypt did not survive. Most people believe a mighty empire must fall because of one decisive battle or one catastrophic invasion. But Egypt's story is far more unsettling. There was no single day when everything came crashing down. No one watched the last sunset of ancient Egypt knowing it was over. Instead, the world's longest-lasting civilization slowly unraveled, almost unnoticed, one generation at a time. The most fascinating question is not who conquered Egypt. It is why a civilization that overcame droughts, invasions, civil wars, and political chaos for 3 millennia could no longer save itself when the greatest threat came from within. To answer that question, we first need to understand something. Even more surprising, Egypt should never have disappeared in the first place. At first glance, ancient Egypt seemed almost impossible to destroy, while kingdoms across the ancient world rose and collapsed within a few centuries. Egypt endured for more than 30 dynasties. Entire civilizations appeared and vanished, while life along the Nile continued with remarkable consistency. That kind of stability was almost unheard of in the ancient world. Its greatest advantage was not its armies or its wealth. It was geography. Every year the Nile overflowed its banks, leaving behind fertile soil that transformed a narrow strip of desert into one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. The river became Egypt's lifeline, feeding millions of people and allowing cities, temples, and royal projects to flourish for thousands of years. This natural abundance gave the pharaohs something few rulers ever possessed: predictability. Harvests could be planned, taxes could be collected, massive workforces could be organized. The state grew stronger with every generation, and that strength reinforced a powerful belief shared by every Egyptian. As long as the pharaoh maintained harmony between the gods, the people, and the Nile, Egypt would prosper forever. That belief became the foundation of the entire civilization. But hidden inside that very foundation was a weakness so dangerous that once it began to crack, every pillar of Egyptian society would begin to collapse with it. If ancient Egypt seemed destined to last forever, the first signs of its decline were almost invisible. There was no dramatic invasion, no burning of the pyramids, and no sudden collapse of royal authority. In fact, to someone living at the time, Egypt probably looked as powerful as it always had. The temples were still magnificent, religious ceremonies continued without interruption, and the pharaoh still sat upon the throne as the living representative of the gods. But beneath that image of permanence, something fundamental had begun to change. For centuries, Egypt had expanded its borders, conquered neighboring kingdoms, and controlled lucrative trade routes stretching deep into Africa and the Near East. Every successful campaign brought back gold, livestock, skilled craftsmen, rare materials, and thousands of captives who became part of Egypt's workforce. War did not simply increase the empire's territory, it fueled its entire economy. Then the victories became less frequent. Maintaining distant territories demanded enormous resources. Garrisons had to be supplied, roads protected, and rebellious provinces constantly subdued. Instead of generating wealth, the empire was beginning to consume it. Every campaign cost more than the last, while the rewards gradually diminished. Egypt was no longer growing stronger through expansion. It was spending its strength simply to preserve what it already possessed. At the same time, another shift was quietly taking place. Inside the kingdom, the pharaoh was no longer the unquestioned center of power. The priesthood, especially the powerful priests of Amun at Thebes, accumulated extraordinary wealth through donations, land ownership, and tax exemptions. Their temples controlled vast estates and employed thousands of workers, giving them influence that rivaled the royal court itself. For the first time in centuries, authority inside Egypt was divided. Decisions that had once flowed directly from the throne were increasingly shaped by competing political and religious interests. The appearance of unity remained, but behind palace walls, power was fragmenting. Empires rarely collapse the moment they stop expanding. They collapse when the institutions that once made them unstoppable begin competing against one another instead of working together. Egypt had reached that dangerous turning point, and an even greater threat was already approaching. This time, it would not come from ambitious kings or rival armies. It would come from the very river that had given Egypt life for 3,000 years. For thousands of years, the Nile was more than a river. It was the heartbeat of Egypt. Every flood renewed the soil, filled the irrigation canals, and guaranteed another season of abundance. The Egyptians believed this perfect rhythm was proof that the gods favored their land. As long as the Nile continued its sacred cycle, the kingdom itself seemed immortal. Then the river became unpredictable. Its annual floods began arriving lower than expected. In some years, the water simply failed to reach the fields that depended on it. Fertile farmland turned dry, harvests shrank, and grain reserves that had once seemed endless began to disappear. At first, these were treated as temporary setbacks. Egypt had survived poor harvests before. Surely the next flood would restore balance. It didn't. One disappointing harvest became several. Food prices climbed. Families who had always relied on the generosity of the Nile suddenly found themselves struggling to survive. Hunger spread quietly through villages while the great temples and royal monuments still projected an image of prosperity. The contrast between what people saw and what they experienced grew impossible to ignore. The crisis reached every level of society. Workers responsible for building and decorating royal tombs were no longer paid on time because grain deliveries had failed. In an unprecedented moment preserved in ancient records, these craftsmen laid down their tools and refused to work. It became the first documented labor strike in human history. That event revealed something extraordinary. The system that had functioned for centuries was beginning to fail from within. As economic hardship deepened, another question emerged in the minds of ordinary Egyptians. If the pharaoh truly maintained harmony between humanity and the gods, why had the gods allowed the Nile to abandon them? The king's authority had always rested on more than military power. It depended on faith. Every failed harvest weakened that faith just a little more. History often remembers the battles that destroy empires, but it is the slow erosion of confidence that makes those battles possible. Long before foreign armies crossed Egypt's borders, the certainty that had held the kingdom together for 3,000 years was already slipping away. As the people questioned their rulers, ambitious outsiders saw an opportunity that previous generations could never have imagined. When people think about the fall of ancient Egypt, they often imagine a single invading army sweeping across the desert and bringing an end to one of history's greatest civilizations. The truth is far more complex. Egypt was not defeated once. It was conquered again and again, each new ruler leaving behind another layer of change until the kingdom that had once dominated the ancient world could barely recognize itself. As central authority weakened, neighboring powers sensed that Egypt was no longer the unstoppable empire it had once been. The first outsiders to seize the throne were not distant conquerors, but Libyan military leaders who had settled inside Egypt generations earlier. They adopted Egyptian customs, honored the traditional gods, and ruled as pharaohs. To the average citizen, daily life continued much as before. Yet something fundamental had changed. For the first time, the crown no longer belonged exclusively to the ancient royal bloodlines that had ruled since the dawn of Egyptian civilization. Not long afterward, another remarkable transformation unfolded. Powerful kings from the kingdom of Kush, in what is now Sudan, marched north and unified Egypt under Nubian rule. Unlike many conquerors throughout history, these rulers admired Egyptian culture. They restored neglected temples, embraced the ancient religion, and portrayed themselves as the rightful heirs of the pharaohs. Ironically, some of Egypt's most devoted defenders were not Egyptians by birth, but the cycle of instability continued. The mighty Assyrian Empire invaded with an army unlike anything Egypt had faced before. Their military campaigns were swift, disciplined, and devastating. Cities fell, rulers were replaced, and Egypt's independence became increasingly fragile. Although Egyptian dynasties briefly regained control, they were no longer shaping the destiny of the region. They were reacting to forces beyond their borders. Then came the Persians. Unlike previous rulers who eagerly embraced Egyptian traditions, the Persian kings governed Egypt as one province within a vast imperial system. The pharaoh was no longer the unquestioned center of the universe. Egypt had become one territory among many, valuable for its grain, wealth, and strategic position, but no longer the heart of its own empire. This endless succession of foreign dynasties created a question that few people at the time could have answered. If foreigners wore the double crown, worshipped in Egyptian temples, and called themselves pharaohs, was ancient Egypt still truly Egyptian? That question would become even more difficult to answer when a young Macedonian king arrived with an army that would change the ancient world forever. In 332 BC, a 24-year-old king from Macedonia entered Egypt without facing the fierce resistance that had once greeted foreign invaders. His name was Alexander, and unlike the Assyrians or the Persians before him, he was not seen as another conqueror to be feared. To many Egyptians, he was something entirely different. He was a liberator. After decades of Persian rule, the arrival of Alexander the Great was welcomed by a population eager for change. The Persian administration collapsed with surprising speed, and Egypt passed into new hands almost without a fight. It was one of the most peaceful conquests in Alexander's extraordinary campaign, but its consequences would echo for centuries. Alexander understood something that many rulers had failed to grasp. Egypt could not be controlled by force alone. He visited the sacred oracle of Amon at Siwa, where priests declared him the legitimate son of the god. With a single ceremony, he connected himself to a tradition that stretched back 3,000 years. He did not reject the title of pharaoh. He embraced it, knowing that symbols could be as powerful as armies. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast. He named it Alexandria. At first it seemed like just another ambitious project, but it would soon become the most influential city in the ancient world. Merchants, philosophers, scientists, and scholars from across Europe, Africa, and Asia gathered there, transforming Alexandria into a center of knowledge, unlike anything history had ever seen. After Alexander's death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, took control of Egypt and established a dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies presented themselves as pharaohs, sponsored magnificent temples, and participated in ancient religious rituals. Yet beneath this familiar image, Egypt was changing in ways that could not be reversed. Greek became the language of government, the royal court, and the educated elite. Alexandria flourished, while older centers of Egyptian power gradually lost their influence. For ordinary Egyptians, the temples still stood, festivals were still celebrated, and priests still honored the ancient gods. But the people making the most important political and economic decisions increasingly spoke a different language, followed different customs, and looked toward the Mediterranean instead of the Nile. Egypt had not lost its identity overnight. It was slowly acquiring a new one, and that transformation would reach its dramatic climax with one queen, whose name has become more famous than almost every pharaoh before her. Cleopatra would fight to save her kingdom, but the world around her had already changed forever. When most people hear the name Cleopatra, they imagine the last queen of ancient Egypt. In reality, she was not Egyptian by blood. She was a descendant of the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty established after Alexander the Great's death. Yet no ruler before her understood more clearly that Egypt's survival depended on preserving the image of the pharaohs while navigating a world increasingly dominated by Rome. By the time Cleopatra ascended the throne, Egypt was no longer the unstoppable empire that had once controlled vast territories across the ancient Near East. It remained wealthy, its grain fed millions, and Alexandria was still one of the greatest cities on earth. But power had shifted. The future of the Mediterranean was no longer being decided on the banks of the Nile. It was being decided in Rome. Cleopatra was an exceptional strategist. She spoke multiple languages, mastered diplomacy, and became the first ruler of her dynasty to learn the Egyptian language, allowing her to communicate directly with her people. She understood that military victory against Rome was impossible. Instead, she sought to secure Egypt's independence through political alliances, first with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony. For a time, her strategy seemed to work. Egypt retained its sovereignty, and Cleopatra ruled as a powerful monarch during one of the most turbulent periods in ancient history. But the Roman Republic was collapsing into civil war, and Egypt became entangled in a conflict far greater than itself. The decisive moment came in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium. The combined forces of Cleopatra and Mark Antony were defeated by Octavian, the man who would later become Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The defeat was not merely the end of a military campaign. It marked the beginning of a new era. 1 year later, Alexandria fell. Mark Antony took his own life. Cleopatra followed shortly afterward, bringing an end to the Ptolemaic dynasty. With her death, the title of pharaoh disappeared forever. After more than 3,000 years, there would never again be a king or queen who ruled Egypt as the living embodiment of its ancient gods. Rome did not destroy the pyramids. It did not erase the temples or burn the monuments that had amazed travelers for centuries. Instead, it did something far more subtle. Egypt became another province of a vast empire, valued for its immense wealth and endless grain harvests. The civilization still existed physically, at the independent kingdom that had shaped history for millennia had come to an end. Most history books stop here, as if Rome delivered the final blow. But that was not the true moment when ancient Egypt disappeared. The greatest loss was still to come, and it would happen without a single battle being fought. If you had traveled through Egypt in the centuries after the Roman conquest, you would still have recognized much of the landscape. The pyramids still rose above the desert. The colossal temples of Karnak, Luxor, Edfu, and Philae still stood in breathtaking silence. Priests continued performing sacred rituals, incense still drifted through temple halls, and ancient festivals still filled the streets. At first glance, it might have seemed that nothing essential had changed. But civilizations do not disappear when their monuments fall. They disappear when the knowledge that gives those monuments meaning begins to fade. As Roman influence deepened and Christianity spread across Egypt, the ancient religion gradually lost its place at the center of society. Temples that had once served as the heart of every community saw fewer worshippers. The offerings that had sustained priests for generations declined. Ceremonies that had been performed without interruption for thousands of years slowly came to an end. Then came one of the most decisive moments in Egypt's history. In the late 4th century, imperial decrees against traditional pagan worship accelerated the closure of many temples across the empire. Sanctuaries that had preserved Egypt's religious traditions for countless generations fell silent. The chants stopped. The sacred processions ended. The continuous chain of knowledge passed from one generation of priests to the next was broken. An even greater loss followed. Hieroglyphs, once regarded as the divine language of the gods, were no longer being taught. Fewer and fewer people could understand the inscriptions covering temple walls, tombs, and monuments. The final known hieroglyphic inscription was carved on the island of Philae in AD 394. After that, the writing system that had recorded Egypt's history for more than 3,000 years disappeared from living memory. Imagine standing before the Great Pyramid or the walls of Karnak and realizing that no one around you could explain what the inscriptions actually said. The monuments remained exactly where they had always been, but their voices had been silenced. The Egyptian language itself continued to evolve into Coptic, preserving echoes of its ancient past. Yet as centuries passed, even Coptic gave way to new languages brought by changing cultures and new rulers. Little by little, the connection between the people and the civilization that had built the pyramids grew weaker. This was the true disappearance of ancient Egypt. Not the loss of its land, but the loss of its memory. The stones endured. The civilization that understood them did not. And that raises one final question. If Egypt vanished so gradually that almost no one noticed, what lesson does its story hold for every great civilization that exists today? Ancient Egypt was not destroyed in a single battle. It was not erased by one emperor, one invasion, or one disastrous year. That is what makes its story so extraordinary. The civilization that had outlasted countless enemies did not suddenly collapse. It slowly transformed until the world that had created the pyramids, crowned the pharaohs, and worshipped the gods of the Nile no longer existed. Every stage of that transformation seemed manageable on its own. A weaker harvest, a political rivalry, a foreign dynasty that promised stability, a new language in the royal court, a different religion gaining influence. None of these changes appeared capable of ending a civilization that had endured for 3,000 years. But history rarely moves through dramatic moments alone. It is often shaped by small changes that accumulate over generations until the past becomes almost unrecognizable. This is why the fall of ancient Egypt remains one of history's greatest lessons. Strength alone is never enough to guarantee survival. The Egyptians possessed wealth beyond imagination, military power, breathtaking architecture, and one of the most sophisticated governments the ancient world had ever seen. Yet none of those achievements could preserve the civilization once. The beliefs, traditions, and institutions that held it together began to disappear. Perhaps the greatest irony is that Egypt never truly vanished. Its mathematical knowledge influenced later civilizations. Its architecture inspired generations of builders. Its religious ideas echoed through neighboring cultures. Its art, engineering, and innovations continue to fascinate millions of people today. Even the calendar we use and many aspects of monumental construction owes something to the legacy of the civilization that flourished along the Nile. The monuments remain almost exactly where their builders left them. Every year, millions of visitors stand before the pyramids and wonder how people living thousands of years ago could create something so timeless. Those stones have witnessed the rise of empires, the spread of new religions, and the passing of entire civilizations. They survive because they were built to outlast generations. In many ways, they succeeded. Yet the greatest achievement of ancient Egypt was never the pyramids themselves. It was the civilization that imagined them, organized them, and believed they would connect humanity with eternity. That civilization is gone. Its kings no longer rule. Its priests no longer perform their sacred ceremonies. Its language had to be rediscovered thousands of years later, before humanity could once again understand the stories carved into its monuments. And perhaps that is the most remarkable truth of all. Ancient Egypt did not disappear because its buildings were destroyed. It disappeared because the people who gave those buildings meaning slowly faded into history. The stones remained. The voices behind them did not.